All right, Supervisor, we're up and running.
Thank you, Ariel, so much for your work in organizing the conversations with our fire survivors. Really, really important part of your recovery process and moving forward. I'm very excited about the panel discussion tonight on fire-resistant materials, how to move forward with rebuilding and design to keep your rebuilt home safe. Oh, we will never have fires again. Oh, well, maybe we will, but we want you to be safe for the future nevertheless. A little bit of housekeeping. If you have not joined us previously, please send your email address to ariel.kubujones@sonoma-county.org so that we can add you to our list of fire survivors. And we always send you great information periodically about things you need to know about debris cleanup insurance and certainly rebuilding going forward. Also, you should know that the chat and question and answer has been turned off for this section, but we do have the raised hand function when it comes time for questions of our panelists. Please raise your hand and Ariel will allow you to ask your questions. And I know you will have some questions for them. Great and panel expert advice tonight. So now's your time to ask. And also, so you know, we have had a survey out there asking you what kind of materials you wanted to cover in the future and the frequency of conversations. We may reduce the frequency of these conversations with fire survivors, but we're not going to cut you adrift. We know that you will need some help rebuilding and still getting information on insurance as we move forward, as you move forward with your rebuilding process. And just a note of personal expression. Once again, we are so sorry that you're actually on this phone call. It means you've probably lost a home or have had real damage to your home. No one wanted to have the Walbridge fire and the glass fires envelop us as the Kincaid and the Nuns and Tubbs and Sonoma complex fires did 3.5 years ago. Pace yourself. The recovery is slow. The rebuilding is slow. Be thoughtful about your decisions. Do you even want to rebuild? Always ask yourself that question. Is it easier in your life to move forward with purchasing a home or renting a home for the foreseeable future? So thank you. And I know from experience that the decisions are many and challenging to make with you and your families. So let's get on tonight for the discussion tonight. And again, this is talking about fire-resistant materials, how to design a house, how to build a house so that we'll be safer in the future. Our first expert, as I call her, is amazing. Caerleon Safford from Fire Safe Sonoma and Sonoma, let me see, Sonoma County Fire Prevention. I've known you in a couple of different ways. Caerleon is such an amazing person. She taught me so much about wildfire protection plans, how to be safe, how to create defensible space. And she may decide to shirk some of the questions and turn them over to Nathan Quarles, who will be our second panelist. She said yes. And then finally, James Williams will be our final panelist tonight. So let's move on. Caerleon, lay it on us. What do we need to know? She's looking for her unmute function. I'm going to kill time while you find it. I know you found it just a little bit ago. There it is. She's sharing her screen.
I was looking to share my screen. But now we need to go to the big picture view. Here we go. Little screen, there we go. So I glanced quickly at the participants in the room, and some of you I know, and hello everybody. We're sort of, I'm really kind of hoping that we're all, three of us are going to tag team as we run through this tonight. I'm Caerleon. A lot of you know me from my days at Fire Safe Sonoma. I am now a permanent fixture at Permit Sonoma Fire Prevention, where I work under my fabulous boss, James Williams, who will be speaking as well. I really, really wish I had one of these because I think we really need it. Because if we just had like a wand that we could wave to take away what's happened in the last 5 years, it's been so incredibly world-changing in the way we see our county, and it's the distress is so difficult, and the challenges that we face are so enormous. But, you know, I'm really hoping that as we run through this presentation tonight, what you go away with is some hope that there are things we can do. We can make this better. We can make our communities, our homes better adapted to survive in a wildland prone environment. And that's the spirit that I hope we leave you with. This is an awful lot of words on the page. And this is where I first throw Chief Williams and Nathan Quarles under the bus. And I'm going to let you guys sort of introduce yourselves. And I'd like to sort of start with a discussion about overall codes in general, which is more on their side than my side. So I can read the question and then you guys can launch from there. Are Sonoma County WUI codes any different from California or international codes? For instance, there's a rumor that someone was denied to use redwood siding on a garage, but elsewhere he's read that redwood is allowed. If it's so, let's just launch into a general discussion about codes and what they do and what they don't do.
Thanks, Caerleon. Good evening, everyone. Codes are interesting because codes are living regulations and rules. When you think about it, they change. And what happens in California is the code cycle is based on a 3-year cycle of the International Code Council and other organizations seeking input from the industry, whether it be the fire service, the building industry, in determining features and construction materials that would benefit the public, whether it be in the realm of fire, in the realm of earthquakes, in the realm of flooding. And it happens on a 3-year cycle in which we go to the Board of Supervisors every 3 years with a new code. And a lot of times people, say that, things are more expensive. And it seems as though that's the case. Every time that we're looking to adopt a new code, there's a new regulation and new information that sometimes makes things more expensive. But at the end of the day, through science, we are working to with the industry to provide safety to the community and the public through construction measures and means. I'm going to turn over to Nathan to talk about the specifics of the redwood siding piece, but there are regulations that allow that type of thing, and he'll speak more to that. And then Caerleon, as we move forward, the presentation will also speak to that further. So I'm going to turn over to Nathan. But again, remember, codes are something that's cycled on a 3-year process and typically have input from the building industry, and they're based on things like climatical, topographical, and weather scenarios in terms of fire behavior, things like that. So with that, I want to turn it over to Nathan Quarles, our Chief Building Official.
Thank you, James. Good evening, everybody, and I wish we were meeting under better circumstances. So getting to the question about redwood, redwood is allowed, and it's a nominal 1-inch thick boards by a nominal 6-inch wide in a horizontal orientation. They also allow them in a vertical orientation as well. Same dimensions for the boards, 6-inch by 1-inch thick. So the code doesn't specify these any particular material like this, but what we, I asked my staff earlier this morning because we saw this question, and we dug out a document from CAL FIRE. It's called a listing service, and we can provide this to the community. So California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, Office of the State Fire Marshal listing service. There's a listing number, and it's very specific to the 6-inch wide, nominal 1 inch thick, and it goes through the various species of wood species: redwood, western red cedar, incense cedar, Alaskan yellow cedar, ponderosa pine, Doug fir, and so forth. And so we will provide that either during or after this meeting so that we can get this into your hands so that you can read it specifically. Now, it may be that the inspector didn't know about this listing service at the time the question was raised, but we will make sure that our staff know about this as well. And I got this from the supervisor of the building plan review section, so they should know about it. On the question about the windows, the requirement coming out of the building code is that they're multi-pane, and one of those panes need to be tempered. So multi-pane means more than one, so you could have a double pane. As long as one is tempered, then that meets the code. I didn't look up doors, but it's going to be something very similar. And if there are specific questions about doors, we can get the answer to you.
All right, so I thought that it was appropriate to just remind us of some basic stuff about the bigger picture of fire and what research has been telling us over the last many decades about really what causes home destruction in these wildland urban interface incidents. And the first guy who really came along and said, hey, wait, I keep going to all these places where there are destroyed houses with perfectly green trees all around them. This is not solely a problem of vegetation, which is how things were really thought of before Dr. Jack Cohen came along and sort of got everybody trying to think another way. It's been a very long slog for him to get us all on board, but everybody is pretty much on board now. I would really highly recommend that you Google Jack Cohen. There's a lot of his materials on the firewise.org website because he has a lot of really great stuff to say. And his message basically came down to two things. Wildfire home destruction is primarily related to vulnerabilities on the structure itself and the fuels within 100 plus feet surrounding the home. So those are the two elements that really are going to work together to determine whether or not a home survives. I added my own, because I can do that, I have PowerPoint. I added my own opinions here that we really also need to consider weather and position on the slope in these major factors. As we know, these weather events that we've been having, sometimes sort of all bets are off depending on how hard the wind is blowing. So that's Dr. Jack Cohen. Check him out. He's awesome. The other person who will be informing a lot of what I'll be talking about tonight, whom I am extremely fond of, is Dr. Steve Quarles, who says basically the same thing in a different way. Dr. Quarles is a building expert, and the way he said it is maintaining an effective defensible space, that's 100 feet, and careful selection of building materials are what determines the survivability of the building. So these two very well-researched folks are pretty much saying the same thing. There are two things that we really need to circle up. That's 100 feet, and what are we making our houses out of? And I would agree. Dr. Quarles did a ton of research on this at his lab when he worked for the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, whose URL is right there, disastersafety.org/wildfire. Great place to go about all things building material related. The image of the protector property from wildfire is the California edition of the home guide, which is a wonderful thing to read if you like lots of dense technical information. But he had a lab, he did a lot of tests with ember generators and was able to blast them at buildings and determine, well, can embers get through an 1/8 inch mesh? Do we need something more? Do we need something less? What happens on inside corners? So he's done a lot of the base research that really has informed how we're thinking about this issue. Some really basic stuff about wildfire, you guys probably know this better than anybody at this point, but wildfire, we tend to think of it as this big amorphous thing, but really it's kind of just science, right? Physics. And there are just certain ways that a home can be destroyed by a wildfire. One of the exposures, as we call them, is direct flame. And that's if you have brushy plants or other items that are close enough to your house that they catch on fire and transmit flame to the building itself, direct flame impact. Radiant heat is when there's so much heat that it actually causes the building to ignite without a direct contact from flame. Radiant heat, not as common a cause of home loss in wildland urban interface fires, although certainly is a high risk in densely populated areas such as Coffee Park. So those are two of our things. These are mostly controllable by the property owner and what they do to maintain the vegetation within 100 feet of their home. But we all know now, I used to have to explain what embers were, and I had pictures and movies and all kinds of stuff. This is an ember. Everybody knows what an ember is. Embers destroy roughly 80% of homes. Roughly 80% of home ignitions are caused by embers, which are blowing around during and they're blowing into, onto, under the structure, everywhere. Embers, it looks like a blizzard. They range from the size of a grain of rice to a football or larger even, and they can get in very small places. Inside corners where you have two walls coming together, where debris tends to collect and heat can collect to make a tornado type effect. If the fire gets in there, starts from an ember. So as you're thinking about how to design your home, some of the things you might want to think about are not having those inside corners. Certainly maybe not having them in the direction where the northeast wind is going to impact your property. So there are design elements that you can think about that will help you to design a house that is more resilient to the extreme exposures that we're getting from embers in these wildfire events. Dr. Quarles came up with 6 priorities for structural hardening, and we're going to run through each of these in turn. Nathan and James, whoa, you got to move in my office or the lights turn off. Nathan and James, please interrupt me anytime. The priority order of these items can vary depending on the site. So these aren't written in stone. It's not always more important to do your windows before your decks. It's going to depend on what's going on with the site and what the vulnerabilities are. Roofs, very important element in the discussion and the first thing on the list because they're a big flat surface that lots of things can land on. And if you have a vulnerable roof surface, exposure from embers and so on is going to cause a lot of issues. There's all kinds of different roofing materials on the market. The most common one is asphalt shingle, which is a Class A material. Now, what does that mean when I say Class A? This picture here shows this wooden box here, which you can see it's about 1 foot by 1 foot. It's 3 layers deep. And what that is what is called a Class A brand. And a Class A roof, you'll take this brand, put it on top of the material, catch it on fire, and let it burn for an hour. And if it doesn't burn through, that's one of the things that's going to contribute to that Class A rating. And I'm guessing that Nathan could add a lot to what I just said. We got the question about, our asphalt chain. Okay, a Class A roof is a Class A roof. It will withstand the same exposures. But there are differences in a metal roof. For example, if you have lots of redwood trees around your house, a metal roof, the redwood needles and stuff are going to tend to slough off the roof, which can be a really good thing. More raking for you, but less debris on the roof. So there's a lot of considerations that'll go into that. Asphalt tends to survive better in high wind conditions because the metal will warp a little. So there are all kinds of different reasons why you might want to determine what kind of roof that you want to use on your house. what you want is Class A, and that is what the code is going to demand. Either Nathan or James, who want to chime in?
I think the important thing for people to remember is that a Class A roof assembly, not only is the installation of that a good thing to do, but the maintenance of that. And what happens with building systems over time through seismic activity or just wear and tear is that the resistiveness of it shifts. And so it's important not only that it's installed as part of the building envelope, but that it's maintained in a Class A state. That's absolutely what makes it Class A. And so often people lose sight of that. And so one of the things that you want to remember is, occasionally having that roof inspected and ensuring that it actually maintains a Class A rating. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. That's a super important point. A 20-year asphalt shingle roof is Class A for 20 years. 21 years, it's past the sell-by date, even if it still looks good. And mostly they don't after that much time. So keep an eye on your roof. As it's up there, look for these kinds of cracking and stuff like that. And if you're starting to see that, start thinking about replacing it. Another thing to keep an eye out for as we move into the future is insect critter damage. Insects, this is woodpeckers, which have been making my life heck lately on my one piece of exposed wood on my house. They've pecked all the way through it. So keep your eyes open for stuff that's going on the wood around the building, because this is an ember entry point. Another important thing to make sure is always there is the metal drip edge that goes underneath the roof sheathing and covers up the fascia board. That's really important to make sure that that remains in place on the roof. Keep an eye out for warping. The cracks that you see at the arrow points here, embers can get into those. They will blow right into the roof. You guys are all rebuilding. Probably not going to be an issue for you for a variety of reasons. Debris, when we're talking about the inside corners and stuff, and one place to really think about simplifying maybe is on your roof complexity. When you have places on your roof, like on this one that you see the leaves on, we have what's undoubtedly a Class A shingle roof, which can certainly withstand the burning of that pile of leaves that you see there. The exposure in this picture is not to the roof at all. It's to the walls that are next to it. So if you have a vulnerable wooden siding, that's an exposure not to the roof, but to the siding. You can spot replace siding in some cases to remove some of that risk. You could run a row of asphalt shingles up here. You're rebuilding, you're probably going to be using a non-combustible wall covering anyway. But if you are in an area where you know there's going to be a lot of tree debris coming out of the sky, think about where they're going to pile up and how hard it's going to be to get them off. And if you can avoid creating those places where you're going to get these piles, it's a good thing to think about in your design element. And do keep those roofs clean, especially during fire season, but all year long. Gutters are another important consideration. This is an experiment, the top photo in Dr. Quarles' lab, where he had that gutter full of stuff. And you see it exposes the roof at its most vulnerable point, which is at the edge of the roof, where there's some exposure of the wood underlayment for the roofing material. So you want to make sure that your gutters stay clean. The best way to do that is to have a non-combustible gutter guard. Check them often. Trees, right now the code for vegetation management will allow you to have a green tree over your roof. That's not something that CAL FIRE or County Fire, if we're out inspecting, we're not going to write you up for a green tree over the roof. We can write you up for a dead tree over the roof and have you remove dead materials, but green trees over the roof are okay by the code. But they do provide a lot of opportunity for more leaf debris on the roof and a variety of other things. So there is that to consider. Chief or Nathan, I'm kind of grabbing the horns here. Do you have any comments?
No, I think you're hitting all the points. Thank you.
There we
Well,
go.
just keep going. You're doing great.
Okay. Eaves. Eaves are, the code calls for enclosed soffits now, and I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. The reason that's so important, this is a kind of a funny photo to use for wildfire, but when you have an open rafter tail design like you see here, where you can see the rafters coming down in the fascia board and stuff, what happens is at the outside edge where you can see there's a lot of mold and stuff, that part of the roof and the fascia starts to degrade over time. And when that wood starts to degrade and rot, it becomes more vulnerable to ignition. And our double whammy in this is that I took this photo after a blizzard at my nephew's house one night. And the white material you see piled up in the corner there, that's snow. Now, embers are going to do the same thing. If they're being pushed hard by a fire towards your house, they're going to hit the wall, cycle out, and pile up in the same place. So this is why we have the code now. I'm correct, Nathan, right? That we are requiring enclosed soffits for wood. Where'd he go? He's
I'm
my
here.
wingman. There you are.
Yeah, I'd have to look that up specifically. I wasn't aware of the enclosure, but I do know we have venting requirements for like those round holes. I'm not sure those would meet today's code. I mean, there's
Yeah, and I
mesh,
got vents.
green mesh.
Vents are coming right up.
Yeah.
It's a really good idea to enclose your soffits. It reduces an exposure. So, and I think it's part of code, but sorry to throw you under the bus on that and not know the answer myself. There are all kinds of different vents out there. And this is a slide that I usually use for people who are looking to retrofit their home as opposed to building new. In the wildland urban interface, you will be required to use a WUI compliant vent product. And I have some pictures of those on the next slide. There are all kinds of different ways we can vent. We can vent with ridge vents that run across the top. Generally, a ridge vent that is rated for high wind and rain is also efficient at keeping embers from coming in. Some really vulnerable areas, these gable invents, which is the middle picture on the top row, are particularly vulnerable. So if you have those, you really need to make sure and get a WUI compliant product on those. You can try to look up these WUI compliant vent products on the Office of the State Fire Marshal's website at osfm.fire.ca.gov. I will admit to you straight out that it's a difficult website to navigate around. And if you go to www.disastersafety.org and get the California guide, he has a crumb trail in there that will get you to where you want to go if you want to know what vents are allowed for construction in wildland urban interface areas. Anything to add, anybody?
Just the, we did have some trouble with vents with screens where the openings were too small. So the idea was they wanted to reduce the size of the screening or the mesh to prevent embers from flying in. Well, that worked on that respect, but then spiders were building, they were close enough, spiders were putting webs in them, and that prevented airflow even more. And then that caused temperature extremes in the attic and warping of some of the wood members. So it was a good idea, but there was a unforeseen consequence to those.
Yeah, and a lot of these companies, you may need, if you're retrofitting with like BrandGuard, I talked to their guy a while ago, and if you're retrofitting with BrandGuard, they will give you a calculation for, okay, you're getting rid of your old 1/4 inch mesh vents, which could let spaghetti in. So you're going to have to increase the size of your vent to compensate for the reduced airflow that's coming through these. BrandGuard is a kind of a baffle system that traps the embers inside. Vulcan Vent is an interesting product. It's that honeycomb looking stuff is covered with what's called intumescent paint, which when it's exposed to heat, it swells and closes off so that it's going to stop flame impingement as well as ember intrusion. There's a very fine mesh screen in the back. But again, you have to make sure that it is engineered to move enough air through the system. And in event, make sure you keep an eye on it, that those bugs aren't in there, because water is going to win every time. And you don't want to get mold going and distortion in your interior. So Dr. Quarles puts defensible space at number 3, which I know my chief fire marshal Williams was probably going, wait, no. But the reason that he does that, there is a reason, is that exposures to the house from embers at those super vulnerable points, like mesh that's too big on your vents, those exposures from embers can come when the fire is still miles away. So you can have an ember exposure without ever having a wildfire exposure. And that's why he puts those others higher on the list, because those building elements can be vulnerable even if the fire doesn't get to your property. However, defensible space, as we all know, is an extremely important thing to hold together on your property. Defensible space is a radius of 100 feet or to the property line, whichever comes first. You can't go across the line and cut your neighbor's trees, even if you want to. It's generally thought of in zones, and in the past, we've always thought of it in 2 zones. Zone 1, 0 to 30 feet, and zone 2, 30 to 100 feet. So all we've learned, unfortunately, in the last 10 years about home loss in the wildland-urban interface has deeply ingrained the importance of the 0 to 5 foot non-combustible zone around all structures. And I think that if I was going to say one thing that is like, make sure you hold this one together, I think that this is the one that I would push on the hardest. All of us remember in all these fires, the fires are coming through, they're pretty much gone, and yet houses are popping off here and there in the footprint days after the fire. Often those ignitions are from a very slow smoldering ember cast that landed on a bush that's right up against the house walls, which can smolder for days before it takes off, hits the structure. So you will do a tremendous service to your home survival if the first 5 feet away from the house walls all the way around is non-combustible. Oops, I got a little out of order there. I'm going to go back to that one. What can that look like? Whatever your imagination or your landscape architect can come up with. What we want are non-combustible surfaces. Do not use wooden mulch or that gorilla hair or that red, really flammable mulch right up against the house walls. Use rock, use cement walkways, use something non-combustible as your base. Plants can go in there, but they should be low growing, probably under 10 inches, well maintained, irrigated, and pretty fire safe plants. The most vulnerable area is going to be near vents and under windows. So if you're putting plants in there, try to avoid getting near the windows and under the plants because they can be exposed that way. This is not yet part of the state code for defensible space. I think it's coming. It has become code in San Diego County, now has it as a requirement that you will maintain a 5 foot non-combustible zone. And I think it's coming. And so as you're beginning to your design process, I would highly recommend going ahead and starting with a base of a 0 to 5 foot non-combustible zone around your property. That's going to extend 5 feet out from the edge of decks if you have them. But you really want that non-combustible envelope around your house. It's super, super important. We got a question about trees in the chat. Looks like fire-consumed buildings were more of a threat to the trees than vice versa. I've seen that so many times where the house is gone and the trees are all fine, but they got burned by the house. Not uncommon. Should you be overly worried about trees outside of the 30-foot zone? Defensible space ordinances are not tree eradication ordinances because trees can be a problem, but they are not the problem. The biggest problem is the vulnerabilities on your structure and low growing brushy vegetation within, certainly within 30 feet of the home and out to 100 feet as well. So what we're really after for vegetation management is separation in the crown of the trees so that the crowns aren't growing together into a continuous mass so the fire can just move straight across in the canopy. And especially work on what we call ladder fuels, which are the low growing brushy fuels that can move the fire from the ground up into the tree canopies in the first place. So those are the real things that you want to focus on. Remove your dead and dying, make sure that everything's as lean, clean, and green as you can, especially in that 30-foot zone, and reduce the general density of vegetation from 30 to 100 feet. Chief?
Yes. So when we look at the next question in general, in the glass fire burn, can anyone offer an opinion as to the risk going forward for a fire of that intensity? Is the fuel reduced to a 100 plus year in the past level? Much of the area is said to have not burned in over a century, or could the same thing happen in 5 years, for instance? And the answer to that, and it's an answer that usually here in the legal arena, is it depends. And the reason that it depends is because, fire and the propagation of fire is based on fuel, weather, and topography. We have no control over the weather. We have no control over the topography. What we have control over is the fuel. And when you have intense burning and much of the vegetation is consumed, some dies, but some grows back over a period of time. And for other areas immediately adjacent to where you had main fire propagation, while the vegetation didn't burn, it dried out the vegetation, making it more susceptible and vulnerable to a future fire. And so while you look at the entire picture, it really does depend. What is the moisture level of the vegetation? What is the dead fuel moisture? What is the live fuel moisture? All of these scientific things come into play on the intensity of a fire. From a very common sense basic approach, if everything was consumed in a fire, the reality is that the fire took care of the vegetation, and as the vegetation turns green again, to maintain it in the same state that it was post-fire is going to be to your benefit. So that gets back to what we talked about with defensible space and vegetation management. The reality is that we had homes in Sonoma County and other counties around the state that were built with the 7A building code standards, and those homes were still consumed as a result of the fire. So, but the issue in those cases were the vegetation in many cases. And so the reality is that, as Caerleon alluded to earlier, we'll probably reiterate, the structural hardening, the 0 to 5 foot clearance, the defensible space at 0 to 30, and then again from 70 to 100 feet, along with the structural hardening elements, are what is necessary to potentially thwart the oncoming fire and its intensity. And so again, while there's no specific answer to that question, it depends, and it depends on numerous factors. But again, if you have a structurally hardened home, along with the defensible space, you stand a much better chance of your structure, your home, surviving that oncoming fire. I'll turn it back over to you, Caerleon.
And we have had areas in Sonoma County that burned in 17 and 19. So can these areas reburn? Absolutely. There's a lot of fuel left on the ground in most of these fires. So really get on your 100 feet, your 30 feet, and your 0 to 5 foot, and overbuild that home for wildfire safety. This is another like really important slide. I know we tend to think about vegetation all the time. All the questions are about vegetation, right? And I'll go walking around with people on their properties and they'll be going, oh yeah, the problem is the park down there. Look at those trees. And in the meantime, they've got all of these human stuff vulnerabilities stacked up in the 5-foot zone. Stuff like wood, I see wood piles right stacked up against the house walls. Brooms that have, this was a broom, and this was a Tassa Hara fire many years ago, which was just darn near took that structure out. Wooden planter boxes, garbage cans, which often look like this, right? The garbage man isn't coming yet. So you have all that recycling in there. It's open, it's stacked right next to the house where it's out of the rain. Make sure that as you're thinking about your 5-foot non-combustible zone, you're not only thinking about plants, you're thinking about your stuff and keeping that stuff away from the structure. Because getting out takes a long time. Just say no. There's also a lot of spousal disagreement that comes in this discussion, I find. But I want to keep that wood there. No. Another really critical factor is having 6 inches of non-combustible clearance from the ground up to any vulnerable siding. Not uncommon to see older houses that look like this, sitting right on the ground. Fire gets into that, it's going to walk right up into the walls, and that it's a very bad thing. So you want to maintain that 6 inches of clearing from the ground to the siding. Things tend to pile up there, even if you have a continuous foundation, and you just want to make sure that that gets raked back and you don't end up with siding too close to the ground level. Fences are another thing that have become a glaringly obvious risk, which I didn't even talk about fences 10 years ago. But it's become extremely clear that fences are wicking fire across the landscape. And when they're especially problematic is when you have a wooden fence attached directly to the house, because the fire can follow that fence line all the way up and lead it straight up to the house. So consider alternate fencing materials in general, but certainly consider a non-combustible element where it attaches to the house wall. That could be a metal fence, it could be any number of things. The top right photo there, that whole fence is made of metal, which I think is really kind of cool. Not a bad looking fence. The top left photo, which actually was Steve Hawks took that in Skyhawk, that was a witnessed fire wicking up to that shed. That was extinguished by people who were there on the property. But the fire did walk up the fence straight to that shed, which leads me to another 0 to 5 foot consideration, which is don't forget to look at exposures like this shed that are that close to the house, because that you might want to reconsider where that is or what materials it's made out of, because that, if catching on fire, could have taken the house out. Another significant risk that has been noted is when you have 2 neighbors who both have a fence that has a narrow strip between it, which then becomes full of leaves and nobody can get in there. So it's a really good thing if you can work with your neighbors to have one fence so that you don't get this kind of thing going on between it. So think about the fences. Windows, Nathan already discussed a little bit windows and the WUI thing. This is a slide that I borrowed from Steve Quarles. Basically what the deal with windows is when there's a wildfire exposure, you get all the radiant heat, which is coming out the window, getting that part, which is exposed to the heat, hot. But in the places down below where the frame is, the heating is unequal because the frame is protecting the bottom or top part of that window from getting as hot as the uncovered part. And what that causes, that differential causes cracking. And then you'll get a crack that develops and it'll crack all the way up through the window. If you have a single pane, you're extremely vulnerable at that point because that window can just go out. If you have 2 panes, the first pane is going to protect the second pane. If you have 2 panes and one of them is tempered, you have a much higher temperature failure rate. tempered glass fails at about 665 degrees Fahrenheit, and annealed fails at only 234. So having those WUI windows not only helps with your energy consumption and stuff like that, but they are far safer if they are exposed to the heat of a wildfire. So, and that again is part of code in the wildland urban interface building area. Try them, they're great. So we did have a question about windows, which was, should we consider installing fire shutters, maybe removable design, just for the season to place over WUI windows, assuming that you have WUI windows installed. My non-code answer to that would be, if you have an exposure that you know is there, you know that you can't trim the trees on your neighbor's property, which is too close to your building envelope, and you know it's going to be very hot on that side of the house, having metal shutters that you can close is a really good idea. But it's going to be dependent on what the exposures are. Are you going to take that kind of heat? If you are, certainly would be a good thing to do. Not required by code, but a good practice. Anybody have anything to add? Nope, they're letting me run with it. Ooh. Okay, and this is kind of a Nathan question, I think, too. Nathan, you ready on decks? The question is, many builders here work with chemically treated wood composite materials that meet the WUI standards, but we're hoping to go even further with our decking material and use something like aluminum, porcelain, concrete, or ceramic metal that won't catch fire in an ember storm. Suggestions for contractors or places to look for contractors. Have no suggestions for contractors. I certainly am going to applaud your desire to get away from wooden decks. They are allowed by code, but they do have vulnerabilities, especially in applications like this, where we have the deck is right on the ground. Why didn't we just put a patio here, which is a non-combustible surface? So avoiding wooden decks, if possible, I think is a great idea. This is one of my favorite ones I've ever seen. This is a almost sole survivor on a street in Wickiup after the 2017 fire. And the homeowner made this. I think this is beautiful. I love this deck, Mexican tile. And his house, like I said, was one of the only ones in the neighborhood to survive. However, there was a wooden deck on the other end of the house that did catch fire that night and was extinguished by CAL FIRE personnel who showed up on scene. Do your research, find something beautiful. There's lots of alternative products out there.
And Carol, just to tie into that, I think when you look at that resource, is certainly the Builders Exchange.
James, I'm not hearing you. Could you turn up your volume?
Now you're muted.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yes.
thank you.
Sorry about that.
And just a huge thank you to Caerleon. Great information, and I really appreciate you being here tonight. But I know that Nathan and James Williams also have important information. So James, you wanted to add something, and then we'll go back to Nathan.
Yeah. Just really wanted to say that you have, for instance, the Builders Exchange that may be to answer questions for you on contractors, as well as your design professionals and your architects. They're going to have those resources for you. So utilize their expertise and their skills in their knowledge of the building and fire codes. Thank you.
And I just wanted to emphasize Caerleon's last point about the decks, patios, and porches. Yes, that's how I lost my house. It wasn't only juniper bushes, but the juniper bushes to the deck, to the attic vents. And that was a lesson learned by me. Having no decks on my rebuilt house, they will be patios on grade. So yes, I learned that lesson clearly. I'm not sure which one of you wants to go next. Nathan, do you want to add your comments and then we'll come back to James, or vice versa?
I'm willing to go.
Go for it.
Okay, so what I want to talk about briefly was the rebuilding process. And if you've attended one of these, I think we had one last month, and I talked about the rebuilding process with our permit or our resiliency permit center. And for those of you who were not here last month.
And Caerleon, could you stop sharing your screen and then we
Happy
can
to.
move to Nathan? Thank you.
Thank you for keeping me on track.
Okay, I do not have a PowerPoint presentation. I'll try and keep
Oh,
it short.
shucks.
I know. So the rebuild process. So unfortunately, we had fires in 2017, 2019, 2 in 2020. And so in response to that, the volume of work of rebuilding was just too much for the county. So we contracted out with outside contractor, private firm known as Four Leaf Incorporated. So they have access to roughly 150 staff statewide, plans examiners, building inspectors, same qualifications that our staff have, but just many more of them. And so part of the contract, a couple of main highlights of that contract is we have a reduced fee versus our normal permitting fee. And so one of the reasons for that, it's about a 30% fee reduction. And part of that is that rebuilding after a fire is different than rebuilding new. For example, a lot of the planning issues are not there with a rebuild scenario because the homes are existing, all the subdivisions have been created. It's just a different type review. And there's some things that don't need to be reviewed. So hence the fee reduction. In the contract, we have a mandated 5-day processing time for what we call first review. So your plans come in. We're taking plans electronically exclusively. COVID-19 pushed us in that direction, and so we've been wanting to do that. We've been experimenting with electronic submittals, and due to COVID, we just had to go that way. So everything is 100% electronic submittal. So we'll get your electronic plans. They'll be routed to the RPC or Four Leaf Incorporated. If their on-site staff don't have the capability, they'll send it off to one of their remote locations. They'll plan review it. You or your designer will have comments within 5 days. And then we lose control of it. The county loses control of it. How fast your designer responds to us will dictate when the permit is issued. We're typically seeing 1 or 2 iterations of the plans. So we'll provide comments. Architect or civil engineer will respond. Most of the time it's sufficient. We issue the permit within a matter of weeks. So that's generally a good overview of the rebuilding process. A couple of the pieces of infrastructure I wanted to mention are wells. So in the rural setting, that's a primary source of water for rural dwellings, and then also septic systems. So septic systems is the primary method for domestic wastewater treatment in the rural setting. So our overall presumption is that before the fire, you had an existing well and you had an existing septic system. When people propose to rebuild in kind, same number of dwellings, same number of bedrooms, we're not asking for a new septic system or a new well. On the septic systems, we do ask for a report. We call it a modified findings report. It's where the professional evaluates the septic system to ensure that it's still functioning. We've seen many, small things get damaged, valves, distribution boxes, things of plastic nature. The concrete septic tanks typically survive, but anything that could have melted or burned typically did. And the similar thing with wells. It wasn't the well so much, but maybe the well house, the well pump, the electrical panel serving the well, those type of things that we're seeing, but not the major piece of the infrastructure. So many of these things can be repaired and replaced without a permit. We do draw the line at anything electrical, like the electrical panel for the well would need an electrical permit. Things on the septic system, like if the septic tank did get damaged, that would need a permit, or if you're adding to the dispersal system, that would need a permit. So that's replacing in kind. If you are proposing, say you had a 3-bedroom home, but you now want to replace it with a 4-bedroom system or a 4-bedroom house, that's adding waste flow to the existing septic system. And we would need that septic system evaluated to make sure that it's code compliant and can handle the new waste flow. Doesn't mean a new system necessarily. It could be that the existing one meets current code and could handle that flow. A similar kind of parallel idea on wells, if you're adding dwellings, we may need to do what is known as a well yield, depending on how many dwellings you're adding. But generally, our philosophy is if you replace in kind, you had these two pieces of infrastructure already in place before the fire, and they're going to be sufficient to serve your needs after the fire. So that's my little quick talk, and hand it back to the supervisor.
Nathan, a great information. We can always depend on you, but let me ask you a question. Most people are going to hire engineers and architects and contractors to design their house, who will presumably understand the fire codes, the building codes, especially those that have changed this year. But for those who want to take a stab at do it yourself, how do they get information on what's new in the fire codes and the building codes?
Let me think about that. So we have resources. Taking a step back, just applying. How would one apply and submit the plans electronically to us? We have outreach materials. We've done little videos and step-by-step instructions, so we can provide the links through Ariel and get it out to the community on where our resources on how one applies. The building code between 2016 and 2019 didn't change that dramatically. We did see a couple of the major pieces that changed were on photovoltaic systems. In the 2016 code, it was called what we say is solar ready. The structure and the electrical panel had to be solar ready to receive the electricity from photovoltaic systems. In 2019, there's an actual requirement that every new dwelling in California must have a photovoltaic system placed on that structure. However, for declared disasters such as the ones we're discussing, the state of California provided an exemption to that. So if you're rebuilding from a disaster, you don't have to put on the PV systems. There were some nominal changes on the energy code, but generally the 2016 and 2019 are pretty comparable. We don't know what's coming in the 2021 code. I did went by the office today and noticed that I have the 2021 International Code sitting on my desk still in the wrapper. So I need to crack that open and start what may be coming our way. And so once the ICC publishes there, they distribute to the various states. State of California gets it. The state makes modifications, and then they distribute to all the local municipalities who get a shot at adding things. We typically leave the bulk of it alone. There are some things we do add, but that's the process. And I'm trying to think when, so around fall of 2022, I think is when we would be bringing the code package to the Board of Supervisors.
Great, thank you so much. Chief James Williams, I'm so glad that you're here and working with Sonoma County Fire and helping us to be safe always. So I believe that you are going to be talking about fire prevention and of course the fire codes, ordinance 13A, which governs the space around your home. And I know you're always involved in vegetation management, complaints, and working with our fire departments on complaints and trying to take care of that vegetation, especially before fire season. So help us and elaborate on that a little bit, because and tell us about what vegetation might emerge from fire burned areas, and is it going to be voluminous vegetation, or do people need to take care of it? So take it away.
Thank you very much, Supervisor. Vegetation, it's a living thing, right? Just like we all, on occasion, have to get a haircut. Well, the vegetation has to get a haircut, has to be maintained. The reality is that it's a forever maintenance scenario. And within our county, because we have had these devastating fires, when we look at the proactive nature of the Board of Supervisors and the leadership of the county going back to 2016, that was the first time the county had ever developed an ordinance for vegetation management. And in 2016, the board moved forward and we started a pilot program using the ordinance. And in 2020, we updated that ordinance. And the name of that ordinance is 13A. Everyone's familiar with the term 13A. That's what I hear a lot. And that is the duty to maintain defensible space and the abatement of combustible vegetation and other materials. And what is in that ordinance is really best management practices in alignment with what other organizations and other counties throughout the state of California are doing to develop defensible space. Earlier, Caerleon talked about the 0 to 30 and the 30 to 70 area around a home and the importance of having defensible space. And there are regulations such as ensuring grasses are cut to 6 inches or less, ensuring that dead and dying materials are removed from the property, ensuring that there's proper addressing so the fire department can locate your property, ensuring that there's no dead or dying materials, pine needles, leaves on the roof, ensuring your gutters are clear of that type of vegetation, ensuring that trees are limbed up. If it's a small tree, at least a third of the height of the tree, or in some cases, minimally 6 feet. Really depends on the height of the tree in terms of the treatment that you need to take into account. Ensuring clearance around roadsides. Fire departments have to get into the property. Residents have to be able to evacuate the area. And so having clearance of minimally 10 feet on each side of the road is going to be beneficial. And then there are different regulations depending on where you are in the county. All right, there is what we call the state responsibility area, and there's what we call the local responsibility area. And so the state responsibility area, the minimum code level is Public Resources Code 4291. And then within the local responsibility area, we're looking at 13A and the provisions of 13A. And so with that, that sometimes becomes confusing to residents. Do I live in the SRA? Do I live in the LRA? And our staff was able to help you with that. It just so happens that about 70% of Sonoma County is the SRA or state responsibility area. Therefore, 4291 is applicable in most cases. And you find that work is done to do inspections in that area, not only by CAL FIRE, which has limited resources that does about 2,500 of those inspections a year, but also by the local fire districts that we here in Sonoma County or at the County of Sonoma partner with to do inspections in areas throughout the county. And that can be based on an annual program where the properties are identified and we actually go out and do those certain communities, or based on complaints. Formerly, there was a limitation that if the property was less than 5 acres, that it did not, if it was over 5 acres, excuse me, it would not, 13A did not apply. That was one of the changes that was made this past summer. So now if your property is greater than 5 acres, the ordinance also is applicable to your property. Now, oftentimes with vegetation management, the community, when you think about an unimproved or open lot, has the perspective that it should be clear cut. And the reality of that is that the ordinance calls for the perimeter of the property to be cut. And the reason for that is in some cases, the perimeter of the property or that particular open space or lot is actually agriculture in nature. And so if you go too far in, you would be cutting and destroying crops. And so we don't want to do that. So that's why you look at perimeter cuts on the unimproved parcels in many cases. We look at property lines in particular, areas where fires can spread to an adjacent property. And, the ordinance that we have is a very good start. Recently, a member of the Board of Supervisors sent some information to us about what's going on in some other counties. And so we have started doing research on what's going on in a county such as Butte that has additional requirements that may be of benefit. And so we're at the point that we're doing some analysis on that, and we will provide that information back, and we'll see where that goes in the future. One of the components of the ordinance is, should we find non-compliance, that properties can be abated. We give residents an opportunity to go through due process. We give them an opportunity to bring the property into compliance. Because again, our goal is not to ever have to abate a property, but rather to ensure that people are voluntarily complying with the law, as we know it's beneficial. As Caerleon and Nathan alluded to earlier, you know, it's about the total system of structural hardening and defensible space that creates the safest possible envelope and survivability of a structure in the event of a fire. It provides, through good vegetation, the ability to traverse into the property or out of the property, depending if you're the fire department moving in or residents moving out. And so the ordinance and those details within the ordinance help to support the overall safety of the community. Now, there's a great program that was also instituted in 2014 that can help you with vegetation management and creating defensible space, and that is the County Chipper Program. It's a free service to residents, and it's been in place since 2014. This year, the program was operating 11 of 12 months out of the year. The Board of Supervisors provided additional funding with some of the PG&E money that was available of $150,000 into that program. And so we're thankful for that, because it has allowed us to operate the program longer throughout this year. We have received approximately 1,100 applications this year and completed 950 jobs. Based on that, working with partners to help ensure that we're able to get out to residents' homes and address that defensible space. So don't forget that that program exists. In fact, we are working with currently the Grove Street Fire Safe Council, and we'll be working to complete a community chipper day here in the not too distant future. And so we're working closely with some of the leadership of that organization. So at the end of the day, those fire codes, or that fire code, along with the building codes that we've talked about, help to create the environment or more fire resilient, fire safe community. It is our hope that as we move forward, that we are able to assist residents in answering their questions and meeting their needs to create ultimately a more fire safe community, working in conjunction with the county in partnership. Thank you.
Chief Williams, thank you so much. Caerleon, Nathan, Quarles, thank you all. Now is the time for questions. And I know you on our conversations must have questions. We have a raised hand function in the chat or in the Zoom. And I'm going to turn this section over to Ariel to see if we have any questions and ask our panelists the questions.
Okay, so if anyone has questions, please do use the raise hand feature in Zoom. I'm not seeing anyone raising their hands.
Oh, you mean we have a quick...
I see somebody. Okay. So this is M Hill. You should be able to unmute yourself.
Hi. So I'm wondering, most of this I thought would be very informative for people who have homes that didn't already burn down. Most of this entire event tonight about keeping your house fire safe and everything like that. But what are we doing to stop getting fires that we seem to be the recipient of from Napa and people in Deer Park working on machinery when it's hot and dry? And what are we doing with these wineries and these people that are working on these machines in the summer when it's hot and dry, and then the fires come over from Napa? I mean, we seem to be on this crappy end of Napa fires, and we lost our home this year. We had a fireman come up to our property in August, congratulating us. For 30 years, we've been keeping our house defensible. We have had these giant sleds on top of the roof, a robust fire suppression system working when we left our home the evening of the 28th. We have an 8,000 gallon concrete tank, a 6,000 gallon concrete tank, and a 20,000 gallon pool. We were told when we got our insurance that our appraiser spoke with fire administration, Cindy Foreman, who said that the station would be the first responder to the risk and would arrive carrying very specific 2 500 gallon engines, 2,000 gallon tankers. Sorry about that. Let's see, they were coming from fire station number 6, fire station number 1, fire station number 7 will respond with a total of 3,000 gallons of water. We have concrete tanks. You're still allowing plastic tanks that are gone as soon as a fire hits. I see plenty of properties building all over Coffee Park, all over the area, all with wood fences again. Now, once your house is gone and we've already taken out over 500 trees, we don't have anything anymore except for the 160 acres of burned trees of the property next to us. So I'm kind of a little bit crazy about all these rules and regulations and these things to prevent fires. To prevent the loss of your home. What's going on with the fires that are coming across? We didn't see a single person. Our power was on when we left our home.
Yeah, thank you. You raise many good questions. Let me just take a stab at, first of all, I think you're exactly correct in noting that we're receiving a number of our fires from Napa County coming over the Mayacamas, and now it's happened at least twice, and certainly it happened in Kincaid as well, having that spread of fire. The board does recognize that we've had patterns of fires. We have hired a consultant to work with some of the experts around the state, but also the stakeholders within the county to evaluate the patterns of the winds, the patterns of the fires, and to come to the board with strategies that we could implement and hire folks to help us work on vegetation management, fuel reduction, a lot of which you've just talked about, in order to stop the pattern of the fires. I don't know that we will ever stop the fires because our weather patterns have changed significantly. Look at the gigantic windstorms that we are experiencing. But stay tuned. We did allocate about $25 million from PG&E funding to really work on and implement the strategies going forward. But I think the second question is here's a property owner who's just implemented many things on storing water, providing defensible space, and yet still lost her home. Any suggestions from the panel on what existing homeowners could do to harden homes? And Caerleon, let's start with you. You talked about it a little bit, but are we seeing instances where even if you take all of the steps, there may not be many things further that a homeowner can do?
Weather is such a big factor in all of this. When we have extremely dry temperatures and then we have big winds, it's very difficult to know what the result is going to be. I think that as the years roll on in this new world of extreme fire behavior, I think that we'll be talking more about fireproof homes at several layers above what we're talking about at this point. I think that there are ways to do that. Personally, I'm looking at building a series of cement domes. Nowhere for embers to stop, things can blow around. I think that we're going to have to, as we move into a future which is going to be characterized by extreme weather, whatever that means, I think we're really going to have to up our game so that we can exist in an environment that has wildfire in it. And it's that's the magic wand again. I wish I had the magic wand. I wish that we had some way to make it rain. I wish we had some way to make it so people who've worked so hard to do it right lose their homes. It breaks my heart to hear that, for all kinds of reasons. But it is the reality of the way we're doing things now. I do think there's hope, though. I think that we will be learning more and more and more. The folks that are out there doing research are feeding us a lot of really good data. The 0 to 5 foot non-combustible zone is really huge, and I think that is going to become part of code. And good luck to all of you with your moving forward.
I remember touring the St. Helena Road area with Unit Chief Shauna Jones from CAL FIRE. And we looked specifically at the homes that survived the fires. And it was quite clear, well, it was mostly clear why those homes survived, whether it was the location on the hill, whether it was the defensible space or the fire resistant materials. And so I would encourage everybody to look closely at those homes that survived and to try to figure out what's the key to their survivability. And I know from the fires 3.5 years ago, sometimes it's just the luck of the draw. The winds shift, spares a home, and there is no rhyme nor reason as to why one home is lost and another home actually survived. Nathan, how can we help existing property owners harden their homes?
Well, I think Caerleon and James went through a lot of the measures that folks can do. The one thing I wanted to add from a code perspective is that the code is minimum standards, and the code also is not there to protect every home in every instance. The main principle of the code is provide enough protection so that the people can have time to get out and get safe. For example, we talk about walls being rated for fire, 1 hour firewall, 3 hour firewall, that kind of thing. It's not, you know, when you have an inferno, a 100-foot wall of flame coming your way, you know, the stuff we're talking about is not going to protect it. I mean, the code really, whether we're talking fire, earthquake, flood, the code is again, it's a minimum. It's to buy the occupants time to get out and to get safe.
I was required in my rebuild to put in a water tank in a sort of a storage area and a pressure tank to power the interior sprinkler systems. And it's somewhat amusing to me that those sprinkler systems probably would not keep a house safe in the kind of fires that we've been experiencing. But I've also heard success stories of people accessing water from pools and hot tubs and storage ponds as fire prevention. And firefighters have used the water supply.
Right.
So we're talking about how we encourage people and work through the permitting process of encouraging folks to install ponds on their property that might be used as fire suppression, and certainly water tanks. I wish we could say we would have success in harvesting the rainwater, but our rains have not been sufficient enough, at least this year, to fill a sizable tank. James Williams, any other help suggestions for property owners? And we're not hearing you. I'm not sure why.
Now,
There you go.
We can hear you. Thank
all right,
you.
my apologies. I think I'm having a computer malfunction because it's the same settings, but they're changing by themselves for some reason. So my apologies. You know, I think Nathan and Caerleon alluded to what needs to happen today. The other thing really is this year, again, that weather, right? Lightning. We had lightning and thousands of lightning strikes. And so in most cases, we talk about fire starting 90% of the time being human caused. This past year, a lot of what happened was based on lightning. And so there are technologies that are being explored by the Fire Chiefs Association and various groups, lightning spotters, if you will, to try to get an early start or response to where these lightning strikes are occurring, as well as the funding that's provided by the board to do fire patrols and be proactive and get out front and hopefully keep any fire that starts in the incipient or very small phase. But what's happening is these fires are starting and these winds are blowing at tremendous levels. And Mother Nature is moving faster than human beings can in terms of response. And so it's our hope that with more technology, with more fire patrols, with good construction, defensible space, that entire package working in concert serves a benefit to the residents. But again, I think the efforts are underway. And it's going to be a continuing process, a never-ending process.
I think the glass fire is a case in point where firefighters did see the beginning of the fire, an ember cast fire across Napa Valley, starting at the crest of Spring Mountain and St. Helena Road. And they did some modeling using the wind speeds, and they knew that fire was just going to take off. And so they positioned their equipment and started evacuating immediately that night. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. The weather took over. And even though you had some home hardening and very sophisticated people using vegetation management and fuel reduction, the wind speeds were so significant that those efforts were for naught in most cases. Ariel, next question.
Okay, we have Todd Podol. Todd, you should be able to unmute.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for the great information tonight. And my question kind of has a follow-up to a couple of the callers and Susan's mention about water tanks. We're in a rural area on St. Helena Road, and we have a limited footprint on where we can place a water tank. And I've read through the 13D requirements as the size and the placement of hydrants and such. Is there any restriction on tank placement near the residential dwelling or versus near a non-residential dwelling like a garage where it would be exposed from a fire?
Yeah, I'd have to look up the specific setback, but there is likely to be a setback, and it's going to be a nominal 10 foot or something. So, and the intent of that is if the one or the other structure fails, we don't want it, leaning over and damaging the other structure.
Right.
And so if the water tank needs some sort of foundation or footing, you don't want to be digging in and undermining the dwelling's footing or the garage's footing. So it's that type of issue and setback.
And I had a little follow-up question, if I can. I've heard some anecdotal stories from firefighters that have said they've tried to hook up or have hooked up to a 2,500 gallon plastic tank or fiberglass tank, and they've had issues with them collapsing under the suction. Basically because of an improperly designed tank without venting, or is that just a common issue?
I think it's probably the venting issue.
We can design using a plastic tank and not having that a concern.
Yeah, we don't prohibit plastic tanks.
That answers my question. Thank you.
And just to know, the position of where the fire started at my house, directly adjacent to where the pressure tank was, providing water pressure to the house, meant that pressure tank was destroyed, which eliminated any water supply to the hose bib. So once that happened, there was no access to water up there. And I'd like to try to avoid that, but so I'll carefully think about where I put the pressure tank. I may have to have two, but just that's where I am on a little hill. I need a pressure tank to pressure the water to get up that hill. Next question, Ariel.
Okay, we have Tim McCarthy Smith. Tim, you should be able to unmute.
Hi, Tim. I like your moose.
Thank you. That's a goose on a moose. It was from a Christmas ornament of an elf on a shelf.
I love it.
All right, thank you for taking my question. This is kind of a follow-up to M. Hill a few minutes ago about the fact that the fires are starting in Napa and ending up in Santa Rosa. I took a little, you can call it disaster tourism drive in December. So St. Helena Road turns into, at the Napa County line, Spring Mountain Road. Spring Mountain Road goes down into the town of St. Helena. Then you can take a quick left on Highway 29 up to the Culinary Institute of America, and then a right onto Deer Park Road, which is the east-west divider through the middle of Napa there from St. Helena to, or from Highway 29 to the Silverado Trail. The south side of Deer Park Road is a seasonal water runoff, and it was completely blackened east to west, where the glass fire started on the eastern side of Napa Valley. And it was like a superhighway for the fire that evening to blow across the base of the valley, because of course it has a hard time crossing all the vineyards. And then once it got over to the west side of Napa Valley, then it was free reign up into the hills. Will there be any conversation between the Board of Supervisors of Sonoma County and the Board of Supervisors of Napa County to maybe kind of do vegetation management on the Napa County side to help mitigate some of these fire highways? Thank you for taking my question.
Thanks, Tim. And now you pointed out, I do see the goose on a moose. I love that. There may be conversations between the two counties, and that was the genesis of my suggestion. We're hiring the Center for Law and Energy, I think, out of Berkeley, to evaluate the weather patterns and make some suggestions on some permanent, it's not only fuel reduction, but potentially permanent fire breaks, anything to disrupt the patterns that we've seen over the last number of years. You're absolutely right. And you can just see the funnels for the flames going up the creek shed or the chimneys. And it's pretty instructive. And you were very smart to take the disaster tour. It's certainly instructive for you and will be instructive for us as well. So thanks for the suggestion.
Okay, next we have Amy Robinson. Amy, you should be able to unmute.
Hi, Amy. Look at that beautiful piece of art.
That's my son's choice.
Nice.
Thank you for taking my question and doing this program. My question is related to what you were just saying about I'm so happy to hear that you're working with the Center for Law and Energy. And I was wondering if the consultants are in conversation with any like existing groups, like the Forest Conservation Working Group, that are talking about this question of large scale vegetation management on private parcels. And specifically, if there's any possibility of like expanding a Job Corps program, like maybe there could be some synergy now with the Biden administration really being behind climate resilience, to get the labor to do the work, which, as you know, is incredibly intense. So I guess it's a suggestion and a question.
And short and sweet, yes, yes, yes. They are working with not only statewide experts on fire, but also our local stakeholder groups that have been so instrumental, including the Forest Working Group, the Forest Conservation Strategies. And under consideration, absolutely, are Job Corps programs, Youth Ecology Corps, Conservation Corps, year-round programs that would help us get a handle on our vegetation management through the chipper program, as well as along roadsides. I'm not sure what that would look like yet, but absolutely, that is a great suggestion. And yes, check that one off. We're thinking about that. Chief Williams, what suggestions would you have? I know that Permit Sonoma has applied for a $50 million grant on vegetation management, and we have not heard if we will receive that grant. I would love it. Sounds like a lot of money, but I know it's not going to go very far. So what is part of that grant application?
So currently, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So that application actually just was submitted to FEMA. It went through Cal OES. Our proposal was accepted at OES here in the state and forwarded to FEMA for additional evaluation. So our fingers are crossed that that's going to happen. And what that grant does is provide for, again, creating fuel breaks around populated communities and areas as part of the strategy, along with additional defensible space opportunities for creating defensible space for structural hardening. We currently have one of the grants, the Sonoma County Adapted Fuels Grant that we were awarded, $6.67 million. And the implementation of that grant actually starts in the next couple of weeks. And so there were communities based on the grant guidance identified throughout the county based on looking at fire hazard zone severity maps, working with the local fire district, and understanding what the fire risk and hazards were, or are, I should say. And so we'll start doing evaluations of homes that decide to participate in that program. Letters should be going out by probably the end of next week, giving residents a couple weeks notice in an incremental fashion. And we will do approximately, I believe it's 5,400 assessments throughout Sonoma County in those areas. And so the efforts and support of the board in obtaining and applying for those grants is coming to fruition. And so we're getting started with that, as well as the CWPP update, which was another grant that we were awarded here in the county, and then the grant for the multi-jurisdiction hazard mitigation plan. And so all of the efforts and grants that we have attempted to work for, we have been quite fortunate in receiving, and now the work is starting to begin as part of that process. And so, as you indicated, we're well on our way. It's a living process. It's going to continue. In terms of residents, the things that we've talked about tonight earlier are going to be beneficial.
It would be great if you could provide some details for some of those grants to Ariel so that she could actually send that information out to all of our fire survivors. I know our attendance is a little low tonight, but all of them are so grateful for the great information that she provides, capturing the essence of what you all have said and getting that information out more broadly. We are sadly, go ahead.
Jump in just one quick second for further information on the Wildfire Adapted Sonoma County project. And there is a project area in the sort of St. Helena Road circle up there. So that is one of the communities that's included in that grant area. We're having to rejigger our scope a little bit because we wrote that grant to prevent home loss, and we're having to figure out how to work with FEMA to still provide benefit to the community in a very different situation. SoCoAdapts.org for more information, and you will be hearing more.
Great, thank you. And Caerleon, that was the location where I first met you, up at Monansville, where you worked so wonderfully in developing the community wildfire protection plan. And you taught me so much about that process. And certainly you taught that community so much. Sadly, they lost almost all of the homes, I think all of the homes except for one. But the work continues and the enlightenment continues. Sadly, our time is over. I really want to thank Caerleon Safford, Nathan Quarles from Permit Sonoma, Chief James Williams from Sonoma Fire, and especially Ariel Kuba-Jones, always for helping us to arrange this. And please note that if you need to go back and refer to the information provided, it will be on YouTube, I believe, in a few days. And so you can let people know what was provided on here, and there will be a link on YouTube. And Ariel, any last minute things that I've forgotten?
No, just that I'll send out the direct link, and I've started including all of the previous ones with direct links as well, because I know folks are at different places. And Caerleon, if you could share your slides, I know you didn't get all the way through them, but if you could share those with me, I'll send those out as well.
My apologies for that, by the way.
Lots of information. It's good.
And then just a little note that we're not going to have a second one of these in February, because actually I am going on a vacation on our next week that we're supposed to have this. So
I gave her a really hard time about not being allowed to take a vacation, but this is a long delayed vacation. So she's been working so hard. She deserves it. I want to thank you all.
On March 4th.
Okay, great. Thank you all so much for joining with us for this conversation with fire survivors. Let us know how we can be helpful in the future. And we want to wish you all a good night, a good and safe night, and enjoy this splash of sunshine that we're going to enjoy over the next couple of days. Get out there, take a hike, and be at peace. Thank you so much.
Night, everyone.